Okay, guys, so here we are with Chapter 7, Cognitive Development in the First 3 Years. So we're going to do a little mini topic or mini lecture on the Piaget approach or Piagetian approach. You should have learned about him when we discussed theories. He's part of the cognitive development branch when it comes to child development. So if you guys briefly remember, I won't go into every single one of these, but these are some of the theories that we kind of covered. So there was behavioral. So remember punishments, rewards, classical conditioning. That's part of the behavioral component of development. Psychometric has to do with testing, so understanding psychological responses. So that could be intelligence testing, information processing. So anything that has to do with some type of psychological component and testing it. Then we have the Piagetian approach, and this is more cognitive development. So we'll be talking about that one today. I won't get too much into it right now. If you remember information processing, so working memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, basically how does the brain process information? And in a way, this is kind of looking at development through like a computer model. So there's certain storages where we process information, I guess you could say, with that one. Then we have cognitive neuroscience. So it's kind of the marriage between Piagetian, so cognitive aspects, but then also neuroscience, so more of the brain structure, understanding neuroanatomy, and that different type of thing. Whoops, don't want to move that. Then we have social contextual. So how does culture play a role in how children develop? How does being a certain gender, being from a single family, being in a low income family, and that obviously has a lot to do with how children will develop differently in comparison with their peers. So we'll go ahead and start with the Piagetian approach because that's one of the most important topics, I think, overall in child development. And also you'll continue to see this theory as we go throughout the rest of the chapters throughout the course. So I think it's important to talk about it. All right. So the Piagetian approach. So I don't know if you guys remember this, but basically his name was Jean Piaget, and he was also a psychologist, and he was interested in understanding child development. And through his observations, he created a 4-stage model of child development, which is this. So if you guys remember from the earlier chapters, this is it. So we have, according to him, 4 different stages that we go throughout when we're an infant, toddler, early childhood, going into adolescence, and then finally becoming an adult. Okay, so for this chapter, we're going to focus on this stage, the sensory motor stage. So we won't spend any time on pre-operational, well, maybe a little bit, but not any time on concrete operational or formal operational. Okay, so we'll go ahead and go back to that other slide. Here we go. All right. So overall, the Piagetian approach, as I said, is part of the cognitive domain or the cognitive umbrella when it comes to child development. So whenever you think of something cognitive, we're trying to understand how we think, how we process information. So that's a cognitive component. So the first stage that we're going to talk about is the sensory motor stage, according to Piaget. So what he noticed from around, infancy to about 2 years, children are in this sensory motor stage. So what that means, if you can kind of make sense of it, is their senses and motor activity that are continuously engaging that infant in learning and understanding their own cognitive development. So one of the first things to talk about is schemes or schemas. So this is a term that Piaget uses a lot in his theory, and basically what a scheme or schema is basically just an organized pattern of how someone thinks or how someone behaves. Okay, and these schemes or schemas are the foundational blocks of how we manipulate information cognitively, how we understand information. So I'll give you guys an example of a schema or schemes. So whenever an infant they're becoming more mature, so let's say around 6 months to 12 months, right? They may have, babbling, they may be cooing, they may be making noises, and then obviously around a year you may want them to say their first word, right? And as they continue, usually you want them by 18 months to have more words in their vocabulary, maybe anything from like 12 to 15 words in their vocabulary. Well, schemes or schemas are very important when it comes to language. Okay, so how we think about something is going to be an organized pattern of how we think about it or how we remember that information. So, for example, in a schema for a child in language development, they may know the word animal, right? And they may know that an animal typically has 4 legs, a tail, and has fur. So that's an organized pattern of thought right there. So you're kind of categorizing something into a general domain. So a lot of children, we still do this as adults, but this is how kind of children learn. So sometimes children will make mistakes, right? Because not all animals have 4 legs and a tail and fur, right? But that's just an organized pattern of thought where you can be able to kind of make sense of that information. So I'll give you guys an example of how schemes and schemas are continuously changing, and that's a good thing. When we're an infant and when we're a toddler, our schemas are going to constantly adapt and change, and that's perfectly fine. So let's say we have Jimmy, and he goes to the zoo with his mom. And Jimmy is very attached to his little stuffed animal, and it's a little Dalmatian, so it has a black and white coloring, and his name is George. Okay, and he really is really attached to this puppy dog that's black and white. So they go to the zoo together with his mom, and he sees another animal at the zoo that's also black and white. So the infant or toddler, if the infant obviously has some type of verbalization, they may point to it, right? And they may say the word George, but you typically around toddlerhood you're gonna have more vocabulary. So let's say this toddler says George, George, and points at the zebra. Well, when he's doing that, he's making a false information. He is not understanding that, okay, well, just because my puppy or my little stuffed animal dog has 4 legs, fur, and is black and white, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a dog, right? When a zebra is not a dog, it's actually a different type of animal. So typically the mom or a parent's going to provide more information so that infant or toddler can change that schema. So now he's given more information like, oh no, honey, that's not George, that's not a dog, that's a zebra. Zebras have stripes, and they're more closely related to horses, right? So now they have that new information, and now that child can begin to understand to adapt to the new information in their environment. So the other thing that we're going to talk about with the sensory motor stage is circular reactions. So basically with circular reactions, we have basically it's a process of how infants continually reproduce the same behavior in order to gain some type of experience. And typically when they do this over and over and over again, it's not like they're doing it intentionally. Maybe sometimes it is, but it's usually discovered by chance. So I think I talked about this in the last video. You may have seen very funny videos of babies doing funny things like, banging pots together and mom's getting very irritated. Well, it's an example of a circular reaction, right? It's not that a baby wants to annoy mom or wants to make this loud noise, but they just like to hear the sound be reproduced over and over and over again. And that's probably discovered by chance. It's not like they picked up these 2 objects and knew that they were going to make noise. It usually happens by chance. Okay, so here's the next slide. So as I said, with the sensory motor stage, it has the schemes and circular reactions that are the major components of that stage. So we'll go ahead and talk about how these kind of play out into the next slide. Okay. So when it comes to Piaget's sensory motor stage for infants into 2 years old, there's 6 different substages that we're going to be talking about. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with the first one. So with the first substage, can't talk today. With the first substage, you have the use of reflexes. So this is very important when it comes not only to motor development, but also to cognitive development as well. So babies rely on their reflexes for survival functioning, right? So for example, the rooting reflex is something that's very important, or being able to grasp as well, right? So the sucking reflex, right? So if a child's not able to suck, that's going to have a lot of detrimental issues where that baby may not be able to be given nutrition, not be able to give in a bottle, to be breastfed. So reflexes in general are a survival function. And all infants have reflexes. And typically reflexes are going to disappear over time. So we're not going to need them as we continue throughout the lifespan. So typically around, a year to 18 months, you'll see a lot of these reflexes to become less important. Okay. So overall, with any other reflex that we have, we're not going to have any control over them, right? So for example, if you were to put a baby, let's say you're holding a baby and you're rocking it back and forth, and let's say you put them in their crib, and if they're, aware, they may fly their arms up and forth and their legs up and forth. So they're actually feeling the difference in their environment. So they're understanding that they're being put down and they're kind of bracing themselves, right? So they may sprawl out like a little starfish while you're putting them down. And that's just a inborn natural reflex that has a survival functioning. It's like they're bracing themselves, like they don't want to have any harm or whatever it may be. So that's substage 1. So reflexes are important. Okay. So there's no grasping of an object that they're looking at this point. So this is all just very inborn reflexes in this first stage. Then we have the second stage, which is the primary circular reactions. So we talked about what circular reactions were, but basically, just to kind of refresh, it provides a special means of adapting the first schemes or schemas. Okay, so it can involve stumbling onto a new experience caused by the baby's own environment or the baby's own motor activity. And the reaction is circular because as the infant tries to repeat the event again and again, there's a sensory motor response, okay? And then that first occurred by chance, now it will be developed into a schema, right? So like I said, infants are not intentional in their behaviors. Sometimes, in most cases, it's by chance. And when they do something that they find interesting or they like, they continue to repeat that because they're learning from their environment. So you can think of a circular reaction as something's in a circle. When you go in a circle, it's continuous. You're continuing doing that over and over and over again with the primary circular reactions. So repetition of verbal behaviors or pleasurable behaviors are within the substage 2. Okay. So that's substage 2 when it comes to the primary circular reactions. Another thing that's important as well is adaptation. So according to Piaget, we have assimilation and an adaptation. So assimilation just refers to acquiring new information, just getting new information, absorbing the new information as an infant, as a child. And then adaptation is using that new information to change or adapt that schema. Okay? And that's typically when you see adaptation beginning in the substage 2 of primary circular reactions. Okay. There we go. So then we have substage 3. So these are secondary circular reactions. So we start to see more of an interest in the environment. And as I said, in substage 2, more of those circular reactions happen by chance, right? So once children start to see that it brings them interesting results or very enjoyable, then they're continuously doing that, right? So now actions are intentional, right? They like the sound of the keys banging on the floor. They like it when they laugh and then mom laughs and they laugh again and mom laughs again. And those are intentional, right? But they're not necessarily initially goal directed. So that's the difference. So that you can have intention, but not goal directed. intention. The next substage is substage 4, so coordination of secondary means, schemes. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of memes. Sorry, guys. So this is where behavior continues to become more related to their interests, that brings more results, but now it's more deliberate and purposeful. So now they're learning what they've learned before, so the schemas, that organization pattern of what something they have learned is, or behavior, and they continue to do that. And we also see anticipation of events as well. So it's a higher level order of thinking if you think about it, when a child's able to perceive something and have some type of expectation to that. Okay. Next we have substage 6, right over here. So this is tertiary circular reactions. So now we see more curiosity and experimentation occur. So sometimes there's variations in the schemas that they already developed because they want to see if they have different results, if it's the same outcome. So there's a lot of trial and error typically when it comes to solving problems, when it comes to tertiary circular reactions. Substage 6, this is the last stage for the sensory motor component for Piaget, but this is an important stage because mental representations or mental combinations are being developed. Okay, so what we've talked about within the previous stages of the sensory motor stage are the circular reactions. Well, the circular reactions are developing those organized schemas to have a certain way of thinking, how to process information, how to organize categories. And when they're able to understand that, then they can have more mental representations of what things are, how the world works, whatever it may be. So one of the important mental combinations that starts to appear in the substage 6 is symbolic thought. Symbolic thought leads into the next stage, which will be the preoperational stage. And the preoperational stage is right after the sensory motor stage, and it involves symbolic function, so symbolic types of thinking. So you may see a lot of dramatic play, make-believe play, so using symbols, words, and gestures in order to pretend. Okay, so if you think about it, if a child doesn't understand, what symbols mean, or what words mean, or what certain gestures mean, then they haven't developed those circular reactions. So when developing those, then they start to gain more expansive knowledge of how to continuously build upon those schemas and adapt and change them, and then navigate their environment a lot better. Okay. So, for example, some use of symbols, like I said before, a child may put their hand up to their ear and have a little symbol of a phone, right? That's a great example. Or maybe when a child's on all fours and meowing or mooing like a cow, right? Well, that's a symbolic representation or mental combination of what a cow is represented or an animal is represented like. So an animal walks on all fours, makes noises, etc. Okay, so those are the 6 substages for Piaget SensoriMotor development. I'm going to go back a little bit to substage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 and just give you some examples. So now that we covered them, now we can kind of just review some examples of what that may look like in each substage. So for example, substage 1, which we covered already, an example of that, let's say we have an infant who's about 2 months and she accidentally made a smacking sound after her feeding. She's finding that this new sound is intriguing or interesting, so she tries to repeat it until after a few days, maybe, she became quite the expert at smacking her lips. So that's an example of substage 1. And then in substage 2, let's see, repetition of pleasurable behaviors that first occurred by chance. So let's say around 1 month, babies may start to enter substage 2. So they start repeating chance behaviors more frequently. So let's say that we have, a baby sucking their fist or their thumb. So babies in this substage begin to vary their behavior in response to their environmental demands. Okay, so they may start to see that, oh, this is a little bit pleasurable when I suck my thumb. It gives me, enjoyment, whatever it may be. Okay. Okay. So we'll go to the next ones. So substage 3 and 4 we talked about. So let's see, an example of substage 3, let's say we have, a baby. Let's say she accidentally knocked a toy and then hung in front of her. And she was producing a fascinating swinging motion. Okay, so maybe that toy had, a hanging string, and she could see it now hang above her, and she sees that. So maybe over the next 3 days, she tries to repeat the effect over and over and over again, and gradually now she's forming a hitting scheme. Okay, that would be an example of 3, because now she's anticipating how that event may happen, right? And she's learning from the previous schemes as well. Oops, sorry, up here. And then substage 4, let's see. They become better at anticipating events. So they start to, at 10 months, maybe a baby will crawl. And then after, let's say, she puts on her coat, maybe she starts to get a little bit upset because she knows mom is leaving for work. So now she's anticipating events. And I've seen it a lot. When it comes to working with children, they start to anticipate certain things happening. Especially if you work in an early childhood education classroom, they start to really understand routine and they anticipate things, even at this very young age as well. Okay, let's go to the next one. Let's see. Oh, okay, substage 5. So they're going to start to repeat things with more variation. So remember when I talked about when children or infants will drop objects over and over and over again because, they are intrigued by the sound or whatever it may be. So now they're deliberately exploring their environment more. And that's usually around 12 to 18 months where we start to see this tertiary circular reaction. So now they're becoming more problem solvers. So let's say, for example, So let's say a baby figured out how to fit a shape through a hole in one of those little containers by turning and twisting it until it fell through. And then maybe how to use a stick to get to toys that were out of reach. Those would be very much tertiary circular reactions. So more experimentation, using objects in different ways is very much part of this tertiary circular reaction. All right, so substage 6, this is where mental representations or mental combinations occur. So they usually start to gain more representations of both images and concepts. So like I said, how things look, colors, different colors, red, blue, green, different animals. Those are all different images that are being much learned by the infant. And then also within those images, there's concepts. So you can kind of think of an image of, let's say, a dog, right? And then within going down that way, let's say you have like a little tree going down. Well, concepts are part of that big general idea of a dog. So some concepts of a dog could be 4 legs, it has fur, they're a pet, they have a tail, they bark. Those are all concepts of that word, a dog. Okay? And you'll start to see more of those understandings of mental representations, usually around the 18 to 24 months. Okay? All right, so this is the last slide that we'll discuss for this little mini lecture. So one of the major, milestones or levels where an infant needs to hit by the end of the sensory motor stage is the idea of object permanence. So it's a very fancy word, but really it's not too complicated. So basically it just means that a baby is able to understand that even though they can't see an object, that it's still there, even when it's not necessarily in their visual field. So a good example of what I'm talking about is a Jack-in-the-Box, right? So not Jack-in-the-Box like, burgers, sorry guys, but no, an actual Jack-in-the-Box like the older toys that a lot of people don't use anymore. But if you guys remember what Jack-in-the-Box is, it's a box, and then there's a little opening at the top of the box, and there's like a little toy clown or Joker, whatever it may be, and it's called Jack, right? So it's inside of that little top area compartment, and when you spin that, I'm trying to think of what the word is. I guess when you turn the Jack-in-the-Box and it has the music playing, well, at some point the Jack-in-the-Box is going to pop out, right? So a lot of children will find this very intriguing, very fascinating, right? So every time the Jack appears and pops out, they may get surprised, they may get scared, they may laugh, or whatever it may be. But then when you put it right back, then they may stop laughing, and they may be a little bit confused and be like, oh, where did the Jack go? Where did the little clown go? And this is the same idea with also peekaboo, right? I'm sure a lot of you have played peekaboo with, maybe your own children, or if you work with children. When you play peekaboo, you hide your eyes, and then you say peekaboo, and you show your eyes, and the baby may be very interested, starts laughing, and then you hide your eyes or hide your face, and they stop. Well, basically, they're not realizing that because the object's not in their sight, they feel that it's not there anymore. But technically, it is still there. It's just not within their visual field. So typically, object permanence should be developed by the end of the sensory motor stage. And this can be tested. There's been research studies, but this is one research study, and they developed the idea of A, not B error. Okay, so looking at infants, they wanted to see how many times they would make errors when it comes to object permanence. So when it comes to object permanence, like I said, you have to realize that an object is still there even though it's not within your visual field, right? So what they did is that they had a child and then an adult, and they were kind of playing a game. So there was a ball that was on the table, and then a little towel or a little blanket over that towel, right? So they would, have the towel and then hide the towel over the ball, and they would continue to show the ball without the towel and then put the towel on top, and then they had another towel next to it as well, right? So then they would move around the ball, without the baby knowing. And they were interested to see what would happen and to see if they had a tendency to search for a hidden object where it was previously found. Okay, so for this A and B not error, A not B error, so once about 8 to 12 months, they search for hidden objects. They make the A not B search error. So some studies may see that they searched at A where they found the object on several previous attempts, but instead of B with its most recent location, they still have trouble inhibiting a previously rewarded response. Okay, so basically what that means is that whenever you're showing an infant something over and over and over again, so let's say I hide the ball in the A slot with the A blanket versus the B blanket. Well, instead of understanding that I switched it from A to B, they don't really understand that. So let's say I hid the ball on the A side 5 or 6 times. So they became very habituated, very used to that. And then when I switched it, then they anticipated that it was going to be in the same location that they were already exposed to, which was the 5 times in the A slot versus the B slot. Okay. Okay. And then, like I said before, this needs to be developed towards the end of the sensory motor stage, both object permanence, A, not B error, and then lastly, dual representation. We'll see that again, but I'll briefly talk about it. So this is also another cognitive aspect. And basically what dual representation is the ability for a child to understand, or an infant, since we're talking about infants, but an infant or toddler to understand that there could be 2 representations of the same thing, but they can be slightly different. That's why it's called dual representation. So a great example of that is there was another study done by psychological researchers, and it was called the dual representation study. And what they did is they had a toy house, and it had all its different rooms. It had a kitchen, it had a bedroom, it had basically all of the different living areas. And obviously you can play with it, and everything was very much intricately, placed. So, you had your closet, you had your bed, all these different things placed. And then they also had a room that was very similar to that. So they can go throughout the room and see that everything was placed the same way. So what they did to kind of understand dual representation is that a researcher would say, okay, I'm going to put Snoopy in the toy box. Okay, and they would put Snoopy in the toy box in the little doll house or little toy house. It's like, can you go in the other room that's just like this bedroom, and can you find Snoopy? And infants and toddlers who are able to do that, they have dual representation. So they can understand that the toy house resembles also this life-size object of that as well. And they were able to find Snoopy. So usually around 12 to 18 months, you start to see the beginnings of the dual representation. Other than that, I think that's great for this week. You also are in charge of going into chapter 8 on your own, but I've given you a little bit extra for chapter 6 and 7 because I feel like they're a little bit more difficult. Have a great week, and I will see you in class.